Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vietor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
So let's turn to Israel and Gaza because that's obviously the big story in the world right now. So as of Tuesday morning, the Israeli Air Force has said that Hamas has fired more than 3,300 rockets. And over the weekend, the Israeli military did a briefing where they said they had struck 766 targets. I imagine that number is closer to 900 by now because it's Tuesday afternoon when we're recording. Also on Tuesday, the Israeli government closed a border crossing into Gaza after a mortar attack injured an Israeli soldier. This is going to at least temporarily prevent aid trucks from getting into Gaza, so that's worrisome. The UN said that more than 52,000 Palestinians have been displaced by the airstrikes, and I've seen reports of over 200 Palestinians killed by the airstrikes, including several dozen children. Also on Tuesday, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza went on strike. It was a big coordinated strike. And the executive editor of the Associated Press has called for an independent investigation into an Israeli strike that leveled a building that housed the AP and Al Jazeera offices in Gaza. So, Ben, before we get to the Biden response, I just wanted to get a gut check from you, a general reaction to events we've seen over the last few days. You and I were doing a lot of tweeting, a lot of texting over the weekend. I think we both were in a pretty bad place at times. But how are you feeling now?
I mean, I just think that you hold a mirror up to this and it just does not look good. I mean, the human tragedy of seeing, over 60 children killed. That's what I keep coming back to, Tommy, is that how is that worth it? What is that accomplishing? And so, we can unpack all different pieces of this from a policy perspective, but some things are not complicated. And the idea that children should not be killed on that scale is not complicated. It shouldn't be happening. That's one of many reasons why I wish that the Biden administration was more vocal, not just in calling for a ceasefire. They should absolutely be doing that. But in speaking to the human cost of this conflict, and not just kind of speaking about it in terms of like it's a specific challenge of this Gaza war to get through, but it's part of a broader dynamic in Israel and the Palestinian territories that just feels incredibly unsustainable. The language that the Biden team has been using often refers to a need to get to calm. Well, calm suggests kind of like, let's just like not have to pay attention to it anymore. I think what this conflict has done even more than the previous Gaza wars is illuminate how seemingly unsustainable the status quo momentum is in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so again, there's a lot of other things to say here. But that's my main takeaway is that this war needs to come to an end. Efforts need to be undertaken to get at some of the structural issues in Gaza and the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Palestinians turning to nonviolence through a general strike, I think, is a positive movement. And again, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that Hamas is an enormous part of this problem. People who turn to rocket fire as their outlet are never going to achieve anything other than destroying things. Nonviolent political mobilization, as difficult as it is, and as much as it doesn't attract as much attention, tragically, as violence, does feel like a more constructive way to channel so much of the outrage and despair that people seem to be feeling. So we have a lot to unpack, but those were my opening kind of thoughts.
Before we get to Biden response, I mean, I felt like over the weekend that the human cost of this war was unavoidable. I felt like I was constantly seeing images of children being who were wounded or wailing parents who lost a child. And then I heard this interview with a Haaretz columnist named Gideon Levy, who told the BBC World Service that he believes most Israelis are not actually being exposed to what is being done on their behalf in Gaza. And he said that the media in Israel has prevented average people from seeing the toll of the war, both the devastating images of civilian casualties, but also just sort of like the general fear and despair of average people in Gaza who feel like they have no future. I thought that was a very interesting perspective from an Israeli journalist. The other thing I saw that I wanted to flag up top was that Tom Cotton made a floor speech suggesting that the AP was colluding with Hamas, and maybe that was why the IDF struck the building, and that was one of the more fucked up things I've seen in a while. So just throwing those out there.
Yeah, I mean, on the Tom Cotton thing, just real quick, you'll see one of these horrific images, and you'll think, well, this is something that will finally get through to people. And when you see comments like that from Tom Cotton, you realize that there's nothing that could change his mind. Mm-hmm. That there's nothing that could be done in Gaza that he would find like abhorrent or disproportionate. And that's pretty chilling, right? I think the other thing I wanted to say at the top time I mentioned this to you is that like I saw some commentary on like, well, why do we talk so much about this? Not you and me, but just people in general. And again, I think people have to understand that, yes, this gets disproportionate attention in our political and media discourse, but there's a reason for that, or there's several reasons for that. I mean, the first is that the U.S. is not just commenting on this as some third party without a stake in it. If you give $3.8 billion in foreign military financing to a government, a healthy chunk of their defense budget, and frankly, subsidizing the creation of an Israeli defense industry, and then there are these repeated wars like this, you're implicated in that. Like, we are a party to this conflict via our defense relationship with Israel. So that merits attention. Similarly, diplomatically, our obstruction of even a statement out of the UN Security Council on this is we're a party to that as well. I mean, so we can't act like the people are selecting this as something to care about, as if it's just one of many issues around the world and not one in which the U.S. is very much involved. And I think the other thing we have to acknowledge is that this is a unique conflict in that you're talking about, deep connections between the United States and Israel. In many ways, the success of the independence and creation of the Israeli state, has been a multi-decade project of the United States, but also has to do with like the deep interconnection between the Jewish community in this country, and just Americans in general who've cared about Israel. And then you also have a country that is the home to some of the holiest sites of three of the major world religions. So this is going to get attention, and just lamenting that people pay more attention to this and other things, is a way of obscuring the fact that we as American taxpayers are part of this. And we, as people who worked in American foreign policy, were a part of this. And we should all be examining it as honestly and openly as we can. And I'm glad we create the space to do that on this podcast.
Okay, let's talk about what President Biden is doing to manage this conflict. So, Ben, here's the things we know so far. The White House dispatched an envoy to conduct shuttle diplomacy between the two sides. Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, he's been talking to the Israelis, the Palestinian leaders, and basically anyone else that can be helpful. President Biden himself talked with Prime Minister Netanyahu on Monday, and the White House readout of that call said, quote, "The president expressed his support for a ceasefire," which was the first time we heard him use that word, I believe. But, I think it's fair to point out that expressing support for a ceasefire is not the same as calling for or demanding one. And so I think a lot of folks, myself included, are trying to figure out why. Like, it seems like a cost-free thing to say both sides need a ceasefire. So, Ben, I was just going to quickly try to summarize some of the reasons I've heard for why Biden isn't more overtly making this call. I just want to get your take and sort of reaction to those arguments, or like anything you're hearing from probably a lot of the same people. So, the first thing I keep hearing over again is just a sincere belief that private diplomacy is the best way to get Bibi Netanyahu to do what you want. You'll hear this from Jen Psaki in her on the record statements, and then others point to the fact that private diplomacy got a ceasefire after 8 days in 2012, but a more public diplomatic effort, they say, in 2014 took nearly 2 months. So they're saying like this is just a more effective way to get it done. An official told the Washington Post that they believe Netanyahu was going to continue targeting Hamas until he thinks the job is done no matter what. So I don't know if that is suggesting that, maybe a ceasefire is just the calls for a ceasefire just missed the point. I wasn't totally sure how to interpret that. And then one report said the administration wants to avoid using words like ceasefire because it could be interpreted as treating Israel and Hamas as equivalent actors in this struggle. And then, one aide told the Post that public pressure on Netanyahu might just backfire and it might lengthen the conflict. So those are some of the arguments I've heard. Obviously, some of them are contradictory, right? It's probably different people talking to different news outlets and whatnot. What do you make against these arguments against calling for a ceasefire? And I don't know, what's the argument for just calling for one?
I watched this play out, and look, I was in similar debates in government. It won't surprise people to know that I was usually calling for or urging that we call for things like a ceasefire in this type of situation. I think that knowing all these folks in the White House and they're in the administration, and they're good people who I'm sure sincerely want the violence to stop. I could detect in their language, they were kind of defensive yesterday that the quiet, intensive diplomacy is a better way of doing this. It felt like a rationalization to me. And look, I've been there, right? So I'll be self-critical. When you're in government, you were there, Tommy, sometimes you're doing something that's not really the right thing, but you convince yourself that it's right, because, having some public, here's the challenge. If you have a public fight with Netanyahu, if you publicly call for a ceasefire, if you're seen as publicly pressuring Israel, that opens a bunch of cans of worms. One, political blowback in the U.S. and the Republicans are attacking you and AIPAC is attacking you and things like that. Secondly, though, if you're publicly calling for a ceasefire and Netanyahu refuses, then what do?
Then what?
Well, then you have then what? And, the then what I would say is that then it becomes untenable, for instance, to block UN statements on calling for a ceasefire. And then you're increasing, the political blowback at home, because suddenly you're working through the UN. And then suddenly there are questions about, well, if you're using certain language about the need for a ceasefire, could that be used to justify investigations of Israel in the international community and all these other things? And so because that's a hard thing to do, to take this public, you kind of convince yourself that there's all kinds of rationales to be doing this privately, right? I think that's wrong for a few reasons. One, I think that sometimes the United States, part of our credibility is just being honest about what's happening in the world, and not sounding like you're speaking in some foreign language of foreign policy speak, or winking at people that, we're doing this privately but not publicly. So one is just kind of being honest about what your position is. I think the second thing is, I heard this analysis time and again with Netanyahu. Like, if you hug him, if you embrace him, if you give him public cover, you're more likely to be able to get him to do things that improves. That is bullshit. That is wrong. That is wrong analysis. We have 8 years in the Obama administration of proof of that. Like that never happened. Like we this idea that somehow we were going to moderate Netanyahu's actions. Netanyahu makes decisions about his actions based on his domestic political standing, not based on doing favors in return for something the Democratic presidents did for him. And so part of what's so frustrating to me about this is we have over a decade of Netanyahu relentlessly undermining a Democratic president, coming to speak to the U.S. Congress at the invitation of the Republican Speaker of the House without telling the Obama administration to hyperbolically argue against the foreign policy of the United States of America to the U.S. Congress, and then fully embracing Donald Trump. I mean, could not have been a closer partner to Donald Trump around the world. And yet that context seems to be missing entirely from how the Biden team is approaching this. It's as if we're back in 2009 or something, and we don't have 12 years of that record, never mind the degradation of the Palestinian circumstance over the course of that time as well. So again, I just think the analysis that and we're going to be able to bank some credit with Bibi, by getting his back, both flies in the face of history, and also kind of lets him totally off the hook for what he's done for the last decade plus here. And the last thing I'd say about this, and this is tied to, again, why do we talk about this issue? This is really undercutting our global standing. I mean, there is a necessity of reestablishing or trying to build up U.S. credibility on human rights and on defense of the rules-based international order. And we've heard that messaging repeatedly, I think for good reason, and I'm glad, from people like Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and even President Biden. But it's so hard when you are one day are speaking about human rights in the rules-based order, and the next day you're literally the only country that is refusing to call for a ceasefire and seemingly okay, at least publicly, with what's happening in Gaza. And the circumstances have gotten harder, not easier, for the United States on these issues after Trump. And, it's not like we were perfect on this in the Obama years either. But I just think that I just don't know why, when you weigh the risks and benefits of being public in your positions, what is truly gained by being private here. Now, if I'm rooting for them, and if there's a ceasefire, I'm sure they'll say, oh, see, we helped broker the ceasefire because it was private. But you still paid a price. Even if there's a ceasefire in the coming days, the impression that was given of U.S. support for what's happened in Gaza is not going to go away, and that's just the reality.
Yeah, look, I'm rooting for these guys too. I hope this private diplomacy approach works. But here's what we know: on Tuesday, the Israeli Defense Forces chief spokesman said the IDF is not talking about a ceasefire. We are focused on the firing. So it doesn't sound like there's a ceasefire imminent. And over the weekend, Netanyahu said the military operation will continue as long as it takes to achieve our goals. And then he pointed to statements from the U.S. and other countries where they talked about Israel's right to defend itself and said, they know and we know that our actions are just and necessary. So to your point, we can try to do this dance where we're privately calling for a ceasefire, publicly pledging support for Israel's right to defend itself. But Netanyahu is hugging the U.S. and making us complicit in what's happening in Gaza to the world. And I think that's creating a very, very challenging messaging framework for the United States that's going to do some damage. Ben, one thing I want to ask you about, which was on Monday's Pod Save America, I talked about that mantra that you and I used to hear all the time, that like the U.S. and Israel shouldn't disagree publicly. And I think, to dig deeper into this, what I don't get about that mantra is that it's just totally ahistorical, right? So 2 examples. In 2010, the Israeli Interior Ministry approved the construction of 1,600 new apartments in East Jerusalem while Biden was visiting Israel. You and I were there for this. Biden was furious. He said publicly that the move, quote, undermines the trust we need right now and runs counter to the constructive discussions that I've had here in Israel. So that was a very public disagreement from Joe Biden. Here's the lead of a New York Times story from August 1982. President Reagan expected outrage to Prime Minister Menachem Begin today over Israel's latest bombing, saying the attacks had resulted in needless destruction and bloodshed. So that's 2 very public examples of the president and the VP disagreeing. And, Biden once said this inscription he wrote to something to Bibi said, Bibi, I don't agree with the damn thing you say, but I love you, which again is confusing because nobody loves Bibi Netanyahu, right? Like Jim Baker once banned him from the State Department when he was Secretary of State. Joe Lockhart, who was Bill Clinton's press secretary, once said that, quote, Netanyahu is, quote, one of the most obnoxious individuals you're going to come into, just a liar and a cheat. He could open his mouth and you could have no confidence that anything that came out of it was the truth. So I guess I'm just trying to understand how like this no daylight approach became the mantra with Bibi Netanyahu, who was perceived by past administrations as someone who was dishonest. And when there's very recent evidence of presidents and Joe Biden himself disagreeing with bad policy decisions.
Yeah, and look, we certainly disagreed. I mean, the last 2 years in government of mine were defined in some part by the disagreements over the Iran nuclear deal, right? I mean, it's possible to do this. I mean, it's a truism that bears repeating that if you have friends and you think your friends are doing something wrong, you should tell them. I don't know why we define a friendship with Israel as a circumstance where we, provide them enormous support, and then can't point out if they do. Netanyahu had no problem pointing out when he thought, what Obama was doing was wrong. I think that part of what's changed, Tommy, from certainly the Reagan point, is this really deep-rooted evangelical Christian support for Israel that has become more and more ingrained in the Republican Party, which assures that there is one major political party in this country that is always going to be in lockstep with Israel, no matter what. And the Trump administration was proof of that. I mean, Mike Pompeo, right, number one enemy of the pod, delivered a speech to the Republican convention with the old city of Jerusalem behind him.
Like from the embassy building.
Yeah. Like, I mean, it was not subtle. It was both
No.
a message about, national security, but it's also a wink message to evangelical Christians. And so I think what's happened politically is as the Republican Party has become more and more fervent in its support for kind of the right wing of Israeli politics, that means that the only place for debate about these issues is within the Democratic Party. And some Democrats are pretty lockstep in their support of Israel too, and groups like AIPAC do spend a lot of time and effort making sure that they are, which means that there is always going to be a political cost or a political fight of some sort in expressing any criticism of Israel. And I remember feeling this very acutely in the Obama administration. If we had some dust up with Netanyahu, usually at Netanyahu's instigation, you could count on a week or two of stories that distracted you from your infrastructure message, and that's exhausting, right? It's like, let's just not have those fights because, and there's good political judgment to say, why have a futile fight with Netanyahu when, I can't really change what he's doing anyway, and I want to focus on these other things. And so that's kind of created a situation where there's a perceived cost to any daylight. But the flip side of that coin, Tommy, is that the situation has gotten so much worse on the ground in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and in terms of the fact of the Israeli government moving further and further to the right, to the point that like Democratic constituencies cannot look at this relationship and see themselves in it in terms of blanket support for everything Israel does, because they're progressive, they care about human rights, and you see this generational change. An AOC or Greg Meeks now is chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee because Jamal Bowman defeated Elliot Engel, who was in line to be chair and would have been, I think in lockstep with Israel in this circumstance. Like Joe Biden cannot ignore the reality that his own base is just going to be more and more uncomfortable with this. And the fact that you have political difficulties because the Republicans will scream at you and some Democrats will be squeamish about this. I'm sympathetic to how hard that is, having been there myself, but it's unavoidable.
Yeah. I want to talk more about the congressional reaction in a minute. But before that, like I tried to round up some suggestions from like sort of smart people that I was reading or people, that I know about things Biden could or should be doing to help, hasten the end of this conflict. I just want to run a few of those by you and see if like any jump out at you as good ideas or bad ideas or things you'd add in there. So some people have suggested just doing more to publicly empower the Egyptians to negotiate a ceasefire. Egypt is talking to both Israel and Hamas. They have actual real leverage over Hamas because they control one of the border entries into the Gaza Strip. Experts think they're the most likely to succeed. Others have suggested asking the various Abraham Accord countries to do more to support the Egyptian negotiations, get them to condemn Hamas, and also like figure out ways they can help the Palestinian people, and then use like the new leverage they have from these agreements to push the Israeli government to do a better job, on restricting settlement construction and all the other underlying issues. There's great NGOs out there that are promoting peace and people-to-people exchanges that need more help. Some have talked about, letting Israel know that after the war ends, the U.S. is just going to be more engaged in reducing the underlying tensions like we saw in East Jerusalem. Others have saying like Biden should embrace the John Kerry plan that was laid out at the end of the Obama administration for a two-state solution, and potentially stop blocking criticism of the bombing in Gaza or calls for a ceasefire at the UN. That was sort of like a long laundry list of potential options there. But I wonder if any of those ideas kind of jump out at you as the most worthy of consideration, or if there's better ideas that I didn't list. I'd love to hear those.
Well, I don't. Yeah, because I don't subscribe to the view that U.S. public pressure isn't helpful. I think the quickest way to stop the actual bombing of Gaza, and the Hamas rocket fire, by the way, is to publicly call for a ceasefire, and to kind of create an inevitability of momentum in the because I'd say even in 2012, by the way, Tommy, I was involved in that, and what we did very publicly is Barack Obama, I remember sitting in Cambodia in a room with Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Tom Donilon, and Jake Sullivan.
Oh yeah, I was there in that
Yeah,
in that
you were
hotel
there.
with
Yeah.
we went from Aung San Suu Kyi's
With the
house,
casino.
this incredible, amazing emotional event, to a smoke-filled fucking casino in Cambodia,
Yeah.
where we were across the street from the Khmer Rouge food mart. I remember that very well, and everyone just sitting around being like, "Oh my God, how do they broker this ceasefire?" Sorry, continue.
No, that's exactly right. And because basically what happened was Obama had to decide whether to publicly send Hillary Clinton on a plane to Israel to negotiate a ceasefire, right? And we knew that was basically, that was public pressure, right? I mean, you don't send your very prominent Secretary of State out there. She can't come back without a ceasefire. Everybody knows that. Netanyahu knows that, right? So the decision, which then I had to announce, I remember in that smoke-filled casino, I remember the absurdity of walking through a bunch of like Cambodian guys playing slots and chain smoking cigarettes.
God, me too.
To go announce that Hillary Clinton was flying to Israel. That was publicly calling for a ceasefire because it was putting Hillary Clinton on a plane to go there, knowing that she wasn't going to leave until we got one, right? So
you disagree with this idea that 2012 was a more private process?
I disagree with that idea that was all private. It was it was private that it was Hillary Clinton there, but what the hell do you think she was there to do? We publicly announced that she was going there to pursue a ceasefire, you know? So that's what I do, end the conflict. I think beyond that, the couple things I point out, the situation in Gaza itself. I mean, because everybody always acts like there's kind of either you're solving the two-state solution or there's nothing to be done. The situation in Gaza is completely unsustainable, right? And what is that situation? Like Hamas wins an election in 2006 and basically takes control of the Gaza Strip in 2007. Israel imposes a land, air, and sea blockade and imposes really strict limitations on anything that can get in and out of Gaza. And this is why people say it's like living in an open air prison. The people there do not have freedom of movement. They have electricity for a few hours a day. They have water for a few hours a day. There's like 40% youth unemployment. Like there's no future if you're a young person in Gaza. Never mind the trauma of these periodic wars, right? It is a humanitarian catastrophe that's been ongoing for more than a decade. And we would painstakingly negotiate with Israel to let more goods in because they would say anything that could have a dual use, a military purpose and a civilian purpose couldn't get in. And that was like, concrete for buildings, right? I mean, and so never mind that people from Gaza couldn't sell their goods into Israel and the West Bank and things like that. That a resident of Gaza who's Palestinian could not go to the West Bank. If they had family there, they just were cut off from those people. That is a humanitarian situation that's untenable. Hamas, yes, has rockets and has continued to rearm with these rockets. But I would argue for the sake of Israel's security. And yes, I associate myself with everybody who says it is untenable for a nation state to have rockets fired indiscriminately at its citizens. I'd say, first of all, that's why we built an Iron Dome system that accounts for the fact that, is one reason why there's such an imbalance in casualties between Israelis and Palestinians. But also, clearly the blockade is not stopping the component parts from getting into Gaza. The tunnel networks and other ways in which they're getting the pieces of these rockets. So what you're doing is you're punishing the residents of Gaza without stopping the flow of whatever's needed to build these rockets from Iran or whoever else into Gaza. I think you have to try a different approach here. And frankly, I think you'd be more likely to dislodge Hamas if you opened up space for the people of Gaza. They don't have a choice right now. They're just stuck there with Hamas, Right. So I would, as much as I'm a skeptic of the Abraham Accords and the kind of motivations of those involved, this is one to turn to the Emiratis and the Gulf countries and say, what is a big initiative to try to dramatically improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza? And in doing so, hopefully empower different political actors in Hamas so that you're both trying to improve the humanitarian situation for Palestinians in Gaza and you're trying to deal in a different way with the challenge of Hamas.
Just on your Gaza point, just two other things, Ben. I mean, yes, Hamas did win elections in Gaza, but not everybody voted for them. I think that's an important point, right? There's not like universal support for Hamas among Gaza's citizens. I'm sure a lot of them hate them in large part because of the realities of the total lack of freedom of movement that you talked about, right? Like if you're a parent with a bunch of small kids and you are just trying to avoid shelling, you have nowhere to go. Nowhere to go. The Navy is by the sea. I mean, I've heard parents, I was listening to an interview today where a father had taken his kids into just the densest part of the city because it was his hope that that's where they'd be safest, because he just hoped that the airstrikes wouldn't hit the most dense urban parts of the Gaza Strip. I mean, that's a hell of a risk to take. That's a scary reality. There's no escaping the shelling for just the innocent families who are involved.
Yeah, and those elections were 15, over 15 years ago. Some of these kids getting killed weren't born when they took place.
Yeah.
The Palestinian Authority had been discredited in a lot of ways. I don't think that you can assert that today we know that if the Palestinian people in Gaza had an actual choice, that they would, I think there's plenty of reason that they wouldn't choose Hamas. And the reality is what you see in Palestinian politics with this general strike today is kind of a leaderless movement, which is great, because the Palestinian Authority and Hamas have both failed the Palestinian people in a lot of ways. Obviously, the Palestinian Authority has been a much more responsible actor relative to Hamas. But yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out, because I don't want to leave people with the impression that there's some kind of massive popular support for Hamas among Palestinians. There's not. I mean, the last thing I was going to say, Tommy, this has been really frustrating to me, is John Kerry did put out these final status positions for the United States, right? Like a new step for the United States to publicly declare, here are our positions on the future borders of an Israeli and Palestinian state, the future security arrangements of a two-state solution, the idea that the U.S. supports Jerusalem being the capital of both countries, right? And the right of the position on the right of return. I don't know why Joe Biden hasn't John Kerry is in the Joe Biden administration. Tony Blinken was the Deputy Secretary of State at that time. Obviously, Joe Biden was Vice President. I do think that gives you at least a foothold when there is such kind of despair about a Palestinian state. Just reassert, hey, here's what we believe the outcome, of these negotiations should be, or at least the starting point for these negotiations should be, so that there's something public in the world about what the position of the U.S. government is with respect to a two-state solution. That won't solve the problem, but I do think it gives you some diplomatic and moral authority to say, here are our positions, and we think you guys should negotiate on the basis of these positions. And this is informed by, and that Kerry made clear in that speech, that wasn't just John Kerry. That was informed by the Camp David process under Bill Clinton. That was informed by the Annapolis process under George W. Bush. That was informed by the Kerry process under Barack Obama. We've been at this for a long time.
Yeah.
If you really want a two-state solution, people know what it looks like. And I don't know why, we took a lot of political heat for abstaining from a UN Security Council resolution that condemned Israeli settlement expansion and putting out those positions. We took that heat in part in the hope that the next Democratic administration, that we were doing them a favor, that we were essentially handing off a baton to them. Here, look, guys, we're giving you these publicly stated positions, so you don't have to go through a laborious process of taking the political hit for coming out with this. So I do think that's something that they should embrace.
Yeah. Two more quicker things on this before we get to other topics. So there's a lot of movement in Congress, but you're starting to see calls for Biden to do more to broker a ceasefire and more calls to just generally exert pressure on the Israeli government. So AOC over the weekend tweeted some pretty harsh criticism of Israel itself, saying, quote, apartheid states aren't democracies, end quote. And she criticized the Biden administration for vetoing a UN call for a ceasefire, saying, quote, if the Biden admin can't stand up to an ally, who can it stand up to? Separate from that, 28 senators issued a statement calling for a ceasefire. That was led by Jon Ossoff from Georgia. Senator Schumer of New York endorsed the call for a ceasefire. Senator Bob Menendez said he was deeply troubled by civilian casualties and the destruction of the building that housed the Gaza Bureau for the AP and Al Jazeera. Those are two very pro-Israel U.S. senators. The House Foreign Affairs Committee Chair, Representative Gregory Meeks, said he's sending a letter to President Biden requesting a delay in the sale of $735 million worth of missiles to Israel. So, Ben, to me, this seems like a very different reaction out of Congress than past conflicts. Do you agree?
Yeah, that never happened when Barack Obama was president. And look, it's a party changing, but this is above all the creation of Bibi Netanyahu, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how many times we've been warning for the last decade that he was putting support for the Israeli government at risk in the United States through his policies and his actions. We cannot ignore that this is an extreme right-wing guy who's said publicly that there'll be no Palestinian state on his watch and that is expanding settlements, including into incredibly provocative places like Sheikh Jarrah, and is basically telling Democrats to go fuck themselves for the better part of a decade. And then you're surprised that Democrats are like, wait a second, pause. Why are we shoveling ever more military assistance to a government that is ignoring us, in many cases insulting us, as certainly was the experience in the Obama years, while clearly having no interest whatsoever in the two-state solution that was supposed to be the basis of how we thought about the Palestinian issue for the last 20, 30 years, right? Yeah. So let's be very clear. This is a creation of Bibi Netanyahu's, right? Democrats are reacting to the changes of the Israeli government more than anything else. And I think it's healthy. And I think Meeks deserves a ton of credit, right? He's been traditionally pretty pro-Israel guy. Like, he's not some bomb thrower, but I think he's right to say, wait a second, like, if I've got my constituents and the Democratic caucus concerned about the civilian casualties in Gaza, I want to know what this arms sale is and to what end are these weapons going to be put? Those are legitimate questions for Congress to ask.
Yeah, it also, I think, shows why elections are so important. I think that, Elliot Engel probably would have taken a different approach if he was still the chairman of that committee, but he lost to Jamal Bowman in a primary recently, and now things are quite different. So primaries matter. Last thought on this. I mean, it's interesting how quickly this became an international cause, sort of like, the Black Lives Matter protest did. And I guess this seems to suggest that Jared Kushner was wrong when he said that the conflict is, quote, nothing more than a real estate dispute. It seems a touch bigger than that at the moment.
Yeah, it matters to people for the reasons I talked about earlier. And I just, the anti-Semitism is awful, right? And has no business in this world. And anti-Semitism has been at the root of so many of the most horrific things that have happened for centuries. And so the first thing is, and I've made clear too, like the right-wing anti-Semitism, it needs to be condemned. It's quite insidious too in the white nationalist movement. But if you are anti-Semitic, like, you are doing no favors for the Palestinians or anybody else, and you have no business being a part of any effort to support human rights. So go fuck yourself, okay, to the anti-Semites out there. I think the second thing is, the emotion that people feel. I just want to validate, like, so much of this comes from people caring about Israel, right? And wanting it to succeed and being worried about where it's going. Because what is the future 5, 10, 20 years from now, right? If they don't deal in a just and equitable way with the Palestinian issue, with this massive asymmetry of power. I think that's what's so worrisome to people. I think we should have huge empathy for Israelis as well, not just because rockets are fired at them. I don't like the shorthand of all Palestinians are terrorists, right? That the Palestinians are firing rockets. I also don't like the shorthand, by the way, that all Israelis are just people who have rockets fired at them, or people that, or you blanketly support Netanyahu's policies. I've been in touch with a bunch of my friends in Israel. I had one telling me about having to go into bomb shelters with her 3 kids, and who are young, and having to explain to them the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I had this image in,
that sounds hard,
because I've got a 6 and 4-year-old. And I was trying to imagine being in a bomb shelter, trying to explain to them why they were there. And by the way, she said, trying to explain why Palestinian kids were in even more danger, right? I didn't like living as an American under Trump. I didn't like the feeling of having someone who was so contrary to my values in charge of the country. And the fact that he was democratically elected made that even worse. I'd like us to express solidarity with the millions of Israelis. And again, it may not be a majority, unfortunately, but the millions of Israelis who feel victimized in many ways. Yes, they're worried about rockets flying at them, but they also look at a government that doesn't reflect their values either. And it's so important that we don't lose sight of that there's solidarity with Palestinian people who are suffering greatly, but there's solidarity with Israelis who don't want this either. And that ultimately, as with all these other mass movements that we talk about all the time on the show, that never quite fully succeed, but feel like they're making progress, like a nonviolent effort over time to pursue a just outcome is worth it. It's worth it, no matter how hard it feels. Because if you give up on that, then you're succumbing to hopelessness, and that's going to be bad for everybody. Israel, Palestinians, America, human rights around the world.
Yeah. Look, I mean, as frustrated as we all were with Donald Trump as president when he didn't win the popular vote. I mean, Netanyahu has been prime minister for years, and he has not come close to winning the popular vote in Israel.
He gets like 30% of the vote.
Yeah, Likud's getting like 30%. I mean, look, the sad truth is that there are parties to the right of Likud that are picking up more and more seats. But anyway, Bibi sucks. He's corrupt. He's a racist. Get rid of him. Okay. Let's turn to some important news about legislation in Congress that would change how the United States military prosecutes sexual assault. The context here is tragic, that there's an epidemic of sexual assault within the U.S. military. The number of cases reported each year has risen since 2006, and the conviction rate is extremely low when cases are actually charged. We're talking about like 7% in 2019. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York and a lot of other great activists have been arguing for years that the way the military handles these allegations is actually part of the problem. So right now, commanders, like the person above you, the person you report to, get to decide whether sexual assault allegations against their subordinates go to trial. So that can discourage victims from coming forward because they don't want to like tell the boss and face retaliation, or it could lead perpetrators to getting more lenient treatment because their commanders argue that they have otherwise strong performance records. So what Senator Gillibrand's bill does is it takes that power out of the chain of command and instead puts a decision to charge these cases in the hands of independent military prosecutors. So Gillibrand has been just doggedly working on this issue for years, and her efforts gained some additional steam recently when Republican Senator Joni Ernst agreed to co-author a new version of the bill. Now we have 61 senators, including 18 Republicans, signed on as co-sponsors, which means the Gillibrand bill is bipartisan and it's filibuster-proof. President Biden has pledged, quote, an all-hands-on-deck effort to combat sexual assault in the military. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has convened a review that is expected to recommend decisions on these trials and how to fix the process. So, a lot more work to do, but hopefully this bill is going to move quickly. And again, just huge credit to Senator Gillibrand for all her work on this over the years.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I'd say, Tommy, is that way back when, this shows you, how long this has been going on, when my wife, Ann Norris, was a Senate staffer, not that long ago, but it was, she was working for Barbara Boxer.
Right.
Boxer was working with Gillibrand on this very issue. And I remember hearing her frustration at this, because really they've tried the other ways. They've tried the military's tried to keep this in the chain of command, keep this in the kind of more traditional military. It doesn't work. It does not work. And by the way, we did not do enough on this in the Obama years. We because we wouldn't take this. What people have learned is you have to take this step of removing it from the chain of command. And so, commend Gillibrand and everybody else in this effort, and hopefully this gets done. And it's common sense. Like, you should have an independent mechanism to review this rather than, keeping it all inside, the kind of somewhat opaque military justice system, which can be wonderful on some issues, but, on this has not met the mark.
Yeah, the data has shown that it's failed, so very overdue change. Ben, we have some fun space news this week. So first, Chinese state media reported that China has successfully landed a rover on Mars. So that would make China the second country to do so after the U.S. Their rover is going to do a bunch of scientific missions, and then it will conduct a 3-month mission to look for signs of ancient life. So look, we wish our Chinese astronaut friends the best of luck. I will say that it would be a lot cooler if they also had, like a little space helicopter hanging on that thing.
But, helicopter.
Get them next time. Second, there's a new space race between the U.S. and Russia. Okay, and this time they're competing to see which country can be the first to film a movie in space. So last year, Tom Cruise and NASA announced that they are collaborating to film a movie on the International Space Station, or ISS. This week, Roscosmos, I hope I said that right, Mike McFall, correct me if I'm wrong, the Russian space agency announced that they too will film a movie on the ISS about a surgeon who goes to space to operate on an astronaut too ill to return home. Ben, are you disappointed that Steven Seagal is not included in any of this? He seems like an obvious choice, but he was left off the roster.
Well, first of all, congratulations to the Chinese. The more rovers, the merrier. It's a great human achievement. I know, Tommy, I was thinking, like, we talked about Putin playing hockey. Why isn't Putin like the star of the movie in the space station?
Get your ass up there, bud.
Yeah. Like, you could go up there. Or maybe like we could have a crossing of the streams, and like, if we're really in the Cold War with Russia, like Tom Cruise is in some some battle of wills with the Russians in the space station at the same time.
That'd be cool.
And friendly, no actual, we want to be careful up there, but
they could play chess up there, make it old school.
Yeah, like exactly like a Cold War era, like chess drama on
Bobby
the space
Fischer.
station or something.
Yeah, sure.
But then at the end of the movie, after 90 minutes of competition, they discover that they have to work together to fix something on the outside of the space station, and then they make peace between nations. Like, that's the kind of movie I could get behind.
They have to work together to get Elon Musk to stop tweeting so that he'll fix the rocket that can bring them home.
Yeah.
Look, there's no bad ideas in a brainstorm. We're just pitching, like, movie studios, call us.
Yeah, we're here. We're available.
They're trying to get the Tesla off the rocket that Elon launched because they want to resell it for as an NFT.
It's called, Pod Save the World Productions. We're ready to go. Yeah.
All right, we're incorporated.
Well, the UFOs are out there. I mean, the UFO news is just passed like a fart in the wind.
Man, I still haven't read the New Yorker story because sometimes they get a little intimidated by the 10,000 words. I'm excited.
Well, what's crazy about it is it's about not just the UFOs themselves, but the kind of subculture of these people who've been at this for a really long time, who are now being validated. And it's got to be pretty satisfying to spend decades insisting that there are these UFOs, and then suddenly everybody's like, oh yeah, they were right. Yeah. there are these
totally.
UFOs.
Absolutely. Yeah, my cousin Wendy sends me all the space news that pops up. I just have to read the really long New Yorker story. Ben, one slightly darker story before we get to fun stuff to wrap up. So we have talked a lot on the show about the ongoing genocide in Xinjiang province in Western China, where the Chinese government is systematically trying to eliminate the Uyghurs and other Muslim minority groups. A lot of that coverage has focused on China putting 1 million or more Uyghurs into these re-education camps and reports of the horrible treatment of detainees. But a new report by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute is highlighting the impact of another tactic that the Chinese government is trying to use to just wipe out the Uyghurs and others, which is coercive birth control. That includes forced abortion, sterilization, and detentions. And as a result, according to this institute, the birth rate across the region fell by nearly half, 48.74% in the 2 years between 2017 and 2019. It fell even more in areas with the largest concentrations of Uyghurs and other minorities. According to the Associated Press, that is the sharpest known decline in birth rates of any territory in recent history. You might remember back in January, the Chinese embassy in the U.S. tweeted a link to a report, big air quotes in report there, I think it was in Chinese state media, that argued this drop in the birth rate in Xinjiang resulted from the eradication of religious extremism, which makes no sense. The tweet literally said, "Study shows that the process of eradicating extremism, the minds of Uyghur women in Xinjiang were emancipated and gender equality and reproductive health were promoted, making them no longer baby-making machines. They are more confident and independent." That was one of the more disgusting things ever tweeted by, a state-run account. It was widely condemned. I guess, I don't know, there's just this accumulation of evidence that this genocide is happening. We talk about it often. We always try to figure out what the world could be doing about it. And I'm at a loss. When you read something this horrific, I'm just at a loss as to how there isn't just more of an urgent focus. But here we are.
I think that if we mentioned the New Yorker story that was recently out, but inhabiting the experience of one woman who did nothing wrong and was thrown into these camps and forced into small cells with other women, denied food, medical care, basically psychological torture, forced to consume all this propaganda. But then, even more harrowingly, once released, nobody wanted to associate with her because, you could get thrown in camps for talking to someone who was in camps. The psychological torture of this, on top of the fact that you have things like, forced sterilizations and people disappearing. This is no joke. I mean, this is a genocide of a people, at a minimum, a cultural genocide and a mass atrocity in terms of human rights violation. I think we have to care as much about this as any other issue with China. I mean, if you look at the actions of the U.S. government, we've taken more forceful action, on trade disputes, right?
Yeah.
Than on this. And that sends a message that we care more about, the trade than this. Give the credit, to where credit is absolutely due. I think Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan have much more forcefully raised this issue, multilateralized it, imposed sanctions. So the trend line is good, I think, in terms of the U.S. elevating this. But I mean, when you look at the scale of this and you look about what does it say, a government that will do this will do other things.
Yeah.
They will do other things within their own territory and abroad. And I'm not trying to be some hyperbolic kind of I want to have a Cold War with China guy. I'm just like, this is what we're looking at, and having spent a lot of time on my book looking at this, all I can say is like this needs to be top priority, right?
Yeah.
And because you know what, certain things are just well beyond the pale.
Yeah, it is a profound evil, and I totally agree with you that President Biden and Jake and Tony, they really have up their game and focus more on this as opposed to President Trump, who basically told Xi Jinping that he was doing the right thing and he should keep it up.
Yeah. He cared more about soybean sales than this,
Yeah, literally. Last thing, a group of more than 100 retired generals signed an open letter that regurgitated some of the most absurd lies and conspiracies about the 2020 election. And, this is really... It's a worrisome reminder that the U.S. military is just not immune to this stuff. They're not immune to lies. They're not immune to conspiracy theories. They are not immune to disinformation. But what I found really upsetting, Ben, is that one of the most celebrated and revered members of the U.S. Navy actually signed on to this letter. This was Rear Admiral Jack Meehoff, added his name to the list of distinguished members of the military who weighed in. And, if Jack Meehoff is on board, so obviously...
This is literally true, Worldos. We're not just kind of broing out here. Like this actually happened. It is on the name is on the list.
It is there. Rear Admiral was a nice touch, by the way. Yeah. So some prankster somehow got in touch with the organizers of this crazy letter with these crazy conspiracy theories. And they were so thirsty to just add another name to their bullshit that Rear Admiral Jack Meehoff was fully represented on this letter. So fantastic work, whoever did that.
Like, you gotta find, it can be a dark world out there, right? This is like a tough pod, but I'm glad that there are heroes out there in the world that are able to look at a situation like that letter circulating and get this done.
Yeah.
Congratulations to you. Thank you. Thank you for your service.
Thank you for your service to all the weirdos. I probably should have stacked together the space story and Jack Meehoff and not put the Uyghur story in between. That's my mistake as a producer of the show. Okay, thanks everybody for tuning in today, and we will talk to you next week.